To the uninitiated amongst you, may I first introduce you to Reddit. Reddit is an online universal forum. Whether you're interested in football or philosophy or simply pictures of cute and adorable cats, you will find on Reddit 100,000 other people who are interested in just the same thing and want to talk about it. The premise is this: you have a username behind which you hide and as an anonymous person, and you engage in these discussions, posting your opinions and images and videos and the like. This is one particularly wonderful piece of one of those forums about an online video streaming platform called Plex. You don't have to understand what it's about to get the nature of the story. The first user, user A, writes this: "This is an alert to any users of Plex. You might think that it's working really well because the online certification process is ridding you of the warnings that you've previously been getting. But be aware, Plex is gathering lists of users' details and their media habits to sell to third parties." Person 2 responds, "That is nonsense. The online portion of Plex is insulated from the servers. It does not know what media you're sharing or store any of your details." Person 1 writes back, "Have you done a deep analysis? Have you read the source code? Go back to your corner, you wannabe computer programmer." And person 2 writes, "I wrote the source code." This is an easy lens through which to read the story of the woman's healing. The Pharisees object on theological grounds, thinking that they're the more knowledgeable ones, and Jesus responds, saying, not quite in these words, "I was the one who created the Sabbath in the first place. I was there for the very first Sabbath. You know, the one that happened after God created everything and then he rested for the first time. I'm pretty sure I know what the Sabbath is all about. And if I think it's appropriate to heal this woman on the Sabbath, then you better believe that it is." In this view, the religious leaders of Israel didn't want to admit that Jesus' healing on the Sabbath was good and acceptable. They were cold and heartless. They would rather have sick people remain ill than to disobey a religious law. It's a tempting reading, and it's one that's greatly victorious for those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ, but I think it's a misleading one. The point of this story is not to show Jesus crushing his opponents in argument or to disparage Jewish religious practice. After all, remember, this is the same Jesus who willingly gives up his life, not the one who seeks to force others to give up theirs. This is Jesus, the Jewish man, teaching in the synagogue, reading and preaching from the book of the law. As often as it has been read like this, there is no room here for Gentile gloating over some Jewish comeuppance. That's not what this narrative is about. In fact, this story ought to do quite the opposite. It ought to drive home to us Jesus' Jewishness. Luke, who is writing this, goes to great lengths to record in the beginning Jesus' circumcision, that initiation into the covenant that Abraham made with God. Luke records worship with sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem, God's dwelling place on earth. And here, Jesus' usual place of teaching is, as always, in the synagogue, in the midst of Jewish worship. He is immersed in the Jewish religious tradition. This should be no surprise to us. And this comes out in our narrative too. Jesus and the ruler of the synagogue engage in this typically Jewish style of argument, in which one argues from the lesser to the greater. Well, you'd help one of your animals, wouldn't you? You'd lead them to the watering hole on the Sabbath. And if you're willing to do that to an animal, how much more ought you be willing to do that to this, the pinnacle of God's creation, your sister in the faith? And we shouldn't read too much anger or malice into this exchange. These are professional thinkers swapping arguments back and forth. The leader of the synagogue is right that work ought not to be done on the Sabbath. It's a clear law laid down in the books of the law, those given to Moses. And his strict interpretation of it, even to the extent of forbidding this woman's healing, can only be faulted for being overly pious. After all, he might argue that if this woman has been hunched over for the last 18 years, then what's one more day to her? Why not heal her tomorrow when it's clear that there are no regulations forbidding it? Why take the chance of possibly going against God's law? And he's not displaying any antipathy towards her. We shouldn't think of her as some outsider despised by the leader of synagogue. After all, she is here at worship in the synagogue. She must have been known within the community and presumably taken care of too, to have lived there for 18 years. It would be a much worse story if Jesus came to the synagogue and he found only those who were well off and in rude health. Much better that the synagogue is indeed full of those who are in need. Nevertheless, Jesus does offer a reinterpretation of the Sabbath law. Not an abandonment, but a reframing. And here, he calls this woman daughter of Abraham. He's reaching back into the Jewish history, again emphasizing the story's consistent Jewish character and showing that the God who made his covenant with Abraham, the same God who ordained the Sabbath in the first place, is the God who desires to see the healing and the wholeness of his people. This is a story about the role and the function of our religious traditions, our claims about what could or should be practiced on the Sabbath, or who is allowed within the walls of our synagogues and our religious communities. And in it, we are taught to recognize that sometimes our religious practices can be hindrances to the inclusion of God's people. And we must be diligent to recognize what theological ideas we hold dearly that disallow the full participation of others. And Luke's Jesus could not be clearer or more consistent on this point. He's no Sabbath breaker. He operates well within the Jewish tradition of the day. But he's also not one to allow the tradition to exclude people from access to the community and for potential for their healing. And many, unsurprisingly in the crowd, agree. These are stories about community. What kind of community do we want to be? Do our religious traditions help us to become that kind of community, or do they hinder our desires? Will our traditions hinder the daughters of Abraham in our day from joining with us? Amen.